Fora TV. The world is thinking.
Welcome to the debate on data management, or whose data is it anyway. If you'd have asked me a few years ago what I thought about medical databases, I would have said, well, they're great. There are things that can be used for research. There are things that we can use to help the patient diagnosis. There are things that can be helped with treatment. What's not to like? And then we did start to discuss this, Tony, myself, and a few others, and we began to ask questions like, well, what happens to patient-doctor confidentiality if the information that you give to your doctor gets passed into a database which can then be viewed by law enforcement authorities, can be viewed by the Secretary of State, and what happens to privacy of medical information when it goes into these databases? And those are the kinds of problematic issues that we're going to discuss today. When we put together this panel, I was slightly concerned that we wouldn't have a particularly heated debate. In the 20 minutes that we spent in the green room before we came down here, we've already had my panelists arguing with each other. I can see that I could well be in trouble keeping them under control, which is not a bad thing. So let me introduce the panel to you today. We have to my immediate left, to your right, Mark Walport. He is the director of the Wellcome Trust. He was formerly a professor of medicine at Imperial College London, and from the reading that I've done around this topic, I would say that Mark's probably written almost every official report on medical databases. He's clearly an authority on this question. To my right and your left, my immediate right, is Professor Ross Anderson. He is Professor of Security Engineering at the University of Cambridge, a chair of the Foundation for Information Policy Research, and author of Security Engineering, A Guide to Building Dependable Distributed Systems. Now, when I started reading for this session, I read Ross's work, obviously, that I could find on the ubiquitous World Wide Web. Ross has very strong opinions about medical databases, although he tells me that that's not true. I think it is from what I've read. His book I also ordered and discovered to my horror that it is actually a tome. It's a monstrous book. I have read the first 50 pages, and it is actually extremely good, but not necessarily relevant for today's debate. And that's why I haven't brought it. To my far right is Tim Kelsey. He is the chair of the Executive Board of Dr. Foster Intelligence. In fact, I think he's the Chief Executive of Dr. Foster. And Dr. Foster Research is the leading health and social care informatics organisation. I'm not sure I know what informatics is, but I think Tim is clearly going to explain to us what that is and how we can use these medical databases to benefit everybody's health. And then on my far left, on your far right, is Professor Geoffrey Rosen, who is no stranger to the battle of ideas. He is the Professor of Law at George Washington University. He's the Legal Affairs Editor, I think that's right, of the New Republic. And he is author of The Unwanted Gaze, which is not a tome, and so I did bring it with me. And I ordered this book through the ubiquitous World Wide Web, and for the beauty of eBay, it comes to me from the Harris County Public Library in Houston, Texas.
I'm kind of Scott.
A place that I
imagine anything worse, even the libraries won't keep your books.
That's right. And
so forget about privacy, too.
Absolutely. Having now read the book, I probably never will use the World Wide Web again.
Well, I'll never use the Harris County Library.
Absolutely. All right, well, that's enough from me. I'm not going to overly guide the debate, but I am going to force our speakers, hopefully, to keep to time. They've been told they have 8 minutes each. I will tap the table twice when you have 60 seconds left. So first up is Mark.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. So let me try and frame this in a way that I think almost all of us will agree with at the beginning, which is that medical data are private, they're confidential, and they're highly sensitive information. And there probably isn't anyone in this room who doesn't have innermost secrets about their identity that they don't want shared with the world. So I doubt there's much disagreement about that. And the second thing I want to say is that I think that the sole purpose of medical records is to provide health care to each and every one of us. But I point out that that happens in two ways. So it happens in the way that each of us gets treated by our doctor. But if one of us has the misfortune to get leukemia or tuberculosis, then our ability to treat that patient depends on knowledge that we've gathered from others. And the children who survive leukemia now are the beneficiaries of the trials that were carried out in the 1950s and 1960s under the auspices in the UK of the Medical Research Council. The second thing I want to say is that there is actually, in spite of what anyone says, a very high degree of trust between patients and their doctors, and indeed between the population at large and scientists. And there have been repeated polls on this broad issue of trust, which actually shows that doctors and scientists come out very well, and journalists and politicians don't do very well. But having said that, and this is something that Nora Neal points out very strongly, trust, of course, it's not a very good question, because actually, do you trust your journalist to tell you the results of the football matches yesterday or the Grand Prix later today? Well, the answer is, of course, you do. And so trust is actually a somewhat variable, context-specific dimension. Now, as a junior doctor, and I practiced medicine, in fact, just up the road from here at Hammersmith Hospital for almost 20 years, but as a most junior doctor, I spent an enormous amount of my time chasing notes that had been lost, sticking pages back into medical records and using those little rings that you used to reinforce the A4 ring binders with, sadly repeating blood tests because the results of the blood tests had been lost or were buried somewhere, re-x-raying people because the x-rays had been lost. And there was a transformation happened at Hammersmith Hospital in the early 1990s when the first electronic data system for x-rays was introduced in the UK. And suddenly x-rays were no longer lost. I could show a patient an x-ray in the consulting room, and at the same time I could pick up the phone to a colleague who was sharing that information with me and with the patient in the radiology department, and we would both be looking at the same x-ray in a different part of the hospital. And so, in fact, the electronic collection of patient information has actually transformed healthcare. And I'll just give you a little quote from an article that appeared in the Washington Post in April 2007, and the heading was "VA takes the lead in paperless care." And the Veterans Administration, which has a very large patient population, more than 7 million people, has been transformed from one of the worst healthcare systems in the United States to actually one of the better ones, and electronic records and databases have been one of the ways that have achieved that. And just one paragraph. The electronic medical record is the most important single development helping to usher in the era of no excuses in modern medicine. It's an age in which clinical decision-making, physician performance, and patient outcomes are increasingly transparent. Patient safety is mechanized, and the once secret medical chart is sometimes open to contributions from the patients themselves. And I would argue that that is absolutely one of the advantages, that patients, we each ought to be able to see our medical records absolutely freely in the same way as our medical practitioners can. So the sharing of records is absolutely essential to the provision of medical care. If we go to our GP on one day and then we're sick with the same illness 3 nights later, we'd like the doctor who sees us then to have access to the records. When our doctor sends us to hospital, we would be horrified if the information from our general practice notes wasn't available to the hospital. If the district nurse comes to look after your diabetic foot ulcer, of course you would expect that person to know that I was diabetic and indeed which foot it was needed treating. And frankly, it would be nice to get all this to work. And I know from the experience of relatives, and I suspect everyone here will have some horror story of where information wasn't shared properly. The notes weren't available, the x-rays weren't available, something went wrong because information wasn't transferred. So the electronic record, held in a database, offers huge additional opportunities. It can provide expert advice. Doctor, do you really want to prescribe the anticoagulant drug warfarin to this patient because he or she is taking an antibiotic which will cause an interaction? So there are huge opportunities. Now, I just want to turn to the health of the population, and that's about research. And let's be absolutely clear about this. The motive of research is to improve health. It's to understand disease better, it's to improve treatment, and indeed it's to improve health service delivery. So looking at each of these very briefly in turn, look at the possibilities in terms of identifying drug side effects. At the moment, if a patient had a side effect in the UK, It relies on a doctor, to fill out a thing called a yellow card. In fact, it's now a yellow A4 pack. And that's a very unreliable method of collecting data. But actually, if we had proper databases, then this is something that would be collected very efficiently. And I remember an anti-inflammatory drug that was introduced about 15 or 20 years ago, which caused a rare but important liver side effect. It took months for that drug to be withdrawn because it took a long while to recognize the side effects. Thalidomide, it took quite a long while to recognize the side effects, however severe they were. The second thing, of course, is that you can monitor practitioner and clinical outcomes. So we all want to know that we have the best doctor, and indeed our judgment of that is usually based on how nice they are, what the patient relationship is with the doctor. Actually, I want to have a surgeon that looks after me well. We need to understand the links between health and environment, so we need to understand disease better, the discovery that smoking is associated with cancer, asbestos associated with cancer. We want to make it easier, actually, to collect repeat prescriptions from the chemist, so better health service delivery. And I would just say that for research, the researcher is not interested in the identity of the individual. If there are 10 people in this audience with leukemia, I don't care who you are, unless I'm looking after you, in which case I care very much. But I just want to know how you respond to treatment. And so the research is done in an anonymized way. So since the thing has knocked, I will summarize. Data is empowering stuff. Health data is about improving health. Better use of data will give us better health. And there's no argument it's got to be well governed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. The thing is happy. Right. Ross, you're up.
Right. Well, I see my role in this debate as representing the views of the average citizen, the average patient, and also the law of the land. Now, I've been involved for over a dozen years, one way or another, with clinical information systems, not just with privacy, but also of safety. And in these years, we've had a number of surveys about what patients' attitudes are towards medical databases and computerization generally. Almost all patients agree that their information should be available to members of the care team that's treating them, the hospital department, the GP. There are one or two exceptions where you want to limit it to a single physician, but they're rare. About 70% of people, and this has been stable over many years, say that they would allow their information to be used in research provided they're asked. But if they're not asked, they strongly disagree with that. They disagree with compulsory record taking. And only about 10 to 20% of people are relaxed about Department of Health civil servants having access to their personal information. Now, I have no problem with clinical information systems. They can bring enormous benefits. But the way in which clinical information systems are built in most of the world is that you have got one system per provider. Your GP has got a database. Almost all GPs use computers nowadays. Hospitals have got information systems too in various states of effectiveness and complexity. And there's generally no problem with that. However, the government vision since 2002 has been different. It's been one of centralization. It's been one of moving data out of hospitals and out of general practices into centralized data farms where on huge quantities of servers everybody's information is kept. Now, this brings all sorts of problems with it. Why is the government doing this? Well, there has been a long struggle between doctors and civil servants over control of the health service that goes back several generations. And civil servants believe that if they've got the control of the data, then this will help them to be more effective at managing the health service, and it will stop pesky people like the BMA getting in the way. In any case, what goes wrong when you start centralizing information? Well, one thing that happens is that systems stop working. Because where systems are bought by doctors, they generally work, and where systems are bought by civil servants, they generally don't work. At least they don't work particularly well for supporting medical care. And you may see a number of stories in the press recently about how the National Programme for IT is grinding to a halt, as various things just aren't considered to be acceptable by hospitals and by GPs. The GPs have managed to largely get out of this because they realized, and they managed to make the case, that if GP systems were no longer bought by GPs but by Whitehall, the pace of innovation would slow to a crawl, and accountability for things like safety and data quality and so on would become problematic. What other things do we expect to go wrong if systems are centralized too much? Well, one example is that last year the police went to a charity that gives pregnancy advice and, among other things, organizes terminations of pregnancy. They said to this charity, please tell us the names of all your patients under the age of 16. Now, under the settled law of the land, the police are entitled to do that. They're entitled to go and get actual evidence of a crime. And if it's special material like medical records or lawyer-client communications, then they have to get a warrant from a Crown Court judge, but that's not generally a problem. The lady who runs the charity, to her credit, told them to take a hike, and they didn't persist, which in a way is a shame, because if we'd had a hard-fought case that went to the European Court of Justice, it could have had some interesting consequences. Now, the thing that concerns me is that in 2 or 3 years' time, some policeman will go to British Telecom with a similar request, and of course they will get a different answer, because the motives facing some 26-year-old facilities manager at BT and the incentives and the culture are quite different from those facing a 55-year-old gynecologist who has got medical ethics, care for her patients, trust from her patients, and her business model all on the line. Let me give you another example. The Home Office has built a system called Asset, whose goal is to predict which kids will offend. The original goal of this system was to see to it that the 20 or 30 scruffiest kids from each estate could be taken and given extra football or whatever after school. But as is the way of the world, this system has been repurposed so that it's now used in giving advice to magistrates on sentencing decisions. And one of the things that they're hoovering up to put in there are diagnoses of ADHD. This means that if you're a GP and you diagnose one of your young male patients with ADHD, then that youngster could find that he gets a stiffer jail sentence as a result. And that, I don't think, is compatible with the purposes for which this information is gathered by doctors. It's not compatible with trust. The third example, and perhaps the most disturbing, you can get from the website of aims.org.uk. AIMS is a childbirth charity run in Oxford by Jean Robinson. And in 1 or 2 areas of the countryside, the National Programme for IT has started sharing information between primary care and social work. The side effect that nobody predicted is that women from the most poor and marginalized backgrounds have figured out that if they tell the doctor something, the social worker will know tomorrow, because the social workers have access to the same database. And as a result, poor women and girls are withholding from their GPs information about, for example, postnatal depression. And Jean Robinson and colleagues are very worried that this is putting women in harm's way and may contribute to maternal suicides. So what can we say about medical informatics? If it's used well, then it can be of enormous benefit. And every country in Europe, in fact every developed country, is busy computerizing healthcare providers. If, however, you share information carelessly and thoughtlessly, as our government unfortunately has been doing with its national programme for IT, then all sorts of bad things can go wrong. And if you end up compelling people to make their information available for research, which the Health and Social Care Act of 2000 did in respect, for example, of cancer information, then you risk other problems. I was once a target of the Animal Liberation Front at Cambridge back at the time when we were building a monkey house. I can tell you this wasn't particularly pleasant. The reason that we got this reaction against research was because of the abuse of animals by researchers in the 1970s. The abuse of human body parts, specifically at Alder, led to a public reaction, which many pathologists say has made their job an awful lot harder. And I am concerned that if we continue taking people's medical information off them, using the state's power to compel, and handing it to researchers, both in universities and in drug companies, without allowing people the power to opt out, then sooner or later there will be a reaction against that that will be really damaging. Now, last year, the House of Commons Health Committee wrote a report on the electronic patient record. They recommended an opt-out. The government said no. Our view on this data centralisation is that there are many aspects of it that are unsafe, and there are a number of aspects of it which are illegal. And now that the National Programme for IT is collapsing, it's time for a serious rethink.
Thank you very much, Ross. Tim?
Can I stand up?
Yes, sure.
This month, Dr. Foster published its annual hospital guide, and the news is sadly mixed. Overall death rates have fallen year on year, but the variation in quality between hospitals remains dreadfully high, at 53% in fact. And what that means is that you can be the same person with the same illness, and just because you go into one hospital rather than another, you have a 53% greater risk of death as an outcome of treatment. Just think about that for a minute. But it's a fact. It's a fact we can act on. It's a fact we know because we have the data. Here's another fact. The hospital guide reveals that women from the most deprived population groups are currently 37% more likely to have a mastectomy rather than breast-conserving surgery than those in the least deprived groups. Again, it's a fact we can analyse and we can act on it. And here's a third fact. In the next 2 hours, it's estimated that there will be more than 5,000 medication errors in English hospitals. We don't have the data centrally pooled to analyse those errors, so people will be harmed and worse while we argue here today in the Royal College of Arts about the merits of more and better data. I set up Dr. Foster in 2000 to provide the public and the professional with independent intelligence on the quality of local health services. In 2001, we published an analysis of standardised death rates by the Dr. Foster unit at Imperial College. That was the first time in the world that death rates had been published across the national health economy, and we revealed a scandal. Death rates varied then between English hospitals by 76%. Until then, nobody had used this patient-level data to calculate comparative death rates. Nobody knew how many avoidable deaths were occurring in the NHS. I was reminded last week by one of those involved in the Bristol Royal Infirmary inquiry into the deaths of children undergoing heart surgery that the parents asked afterwards, why had no one ever told us that Bristol had such a poor record? Analysis of the deaths of those children would have revealed consultants in Bristol had a far higher death rate than their peers, and that's not a hypothesis. The official investigation of the scandal concluded if the patient data had been used, some of those children might not have died. Tragically, according to the hospital guide, 33 trusts in the NHS admit today that they are failing to meet guidelines that require specialist paediatric surgery to be provided by specialist surgeons. All these data derive originally and confidentially from individual patient records that have been pooled centrally. If you were a patient, ask yourself, how many of you would say, no, my data should not be used to save lives? So my first point, I hope, is clear. We need data to measure quality and improve services. We actually need data to save lives. My second is even clearer. We need data to tackle inequity and social injustice. Dr. Foster has spent the last year and a half designing the new NHS website, NHS Choices. Anyone can now look up the performance of their local hospital, find their nearest GP, or simply listen, read, or talk to people with similar health experiences. For the first time, the NHS has put out information, not enough, we need more, into the public domain that will start to allow people to make informed decisions about their treatment. I read somewhere that the most socially transformational technology before the internet was the table. People found out what they needed to know by talking to other people over dinner at the table. That's pretty much how the NHS has operated to date. It's why the middle classes have also had an advantage navigating the NHS. They go to dinner parties. But this table is a real lookout for most people in our society. Data is the antidote. Make data accessible and available, and more people can come to the table. Widespread publication of data becomes a driver for social justice. And maybe this is the most important benefit of patient data in our society. The more that's out there, the more people will be exposed to it. What I'm also sure is that the government hasn't made the case for the benefits of this kind of data as well as it might do. The media and the computer security industry raise hyperbole and they scaremonger over risks to privacy in the use of patient data. They make money out of it. There's a big industry there, so we shouldn't be surprised. I was interviewed for a Panorama programme on Monday, which appeared to argue ridiculously with the use of patient-level data by the NHS to improve services because of fears over personal security. The paranoid tone of the data debate, as evidenced by Panorama, is because the use of identifiable data is always conflated with terrorism and national security. But the argument for wider use of patient data in healthcare has nothing to do with snooping and detection. In my world, there's never been a single example of a patient's privacy being compromised by centrally pooled data. My own organisation doesn't handle confidential data directly, actually. It analyses anonymised data derived from the patient record via a route so secure that even Tony Collins at Computer Weekly had to admit last week that there was no risk to patient privacy. Indeed, the research community in health and social care has a world-class record on privacy and data protection. So who is arguing against evidence-based medicine or better data on the quality and safety of local hospital services? It's not patients. The data exists. It's existed for almost as long as the NHS. The benefits of using it hugely outweigh the risks of ignoring it. Indeed, we have a moral obligation to use it if it makes the NHS a safer service. There is a moment of confidential exposure where an identifiable record is anonymised before it's handed to the analysts. We do, and need in the future to do, to ensure that that moment is secure. Mark's review, the Thomas Walport review, has proposed the extension of the concept of safe havens, like Imperial College, for this purpose. Meanwhile, we must be clear that the data, once anonymised, is of critical importance to improving standards in the NHS. Good government depends on the intelligent analysis of data. Isn't that obvious? It's obvious to me. Indeed, if we want a fair, world-class health and social care system, we're going to have to use much more data. In conclusion, it allows the NHS to understand variation in quality. Its publication, the data's publication, empowers consumers like us to hold the NHS to account. And thirdly, it allows the NHS to understand its customers so that it can plan a service around their needs and stop government wasting resources. Government cannot be intelligent about improving services or personalising services without using data centrally pooled and derived from confidential, identifiable sources. In the NHS, we need more patient data, not less. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Jeff.
I've been asked to talk about law enforcement access to genetic databases and to scare you with dystopian accounts of our post-privacy future. But in fact, you don't need to go to dystopian accounts to recognize the dangers of genetic databases. Look only to your own British DNA database, which is a model for America and provides cautionary tales. The British DNA database suggests the dangers of giving law enforcement access to health databases at all. And what I want to argue, after making clear what these dangers are, is that if these health databases exist, and I don't think Ross and I are arguing against them, we should think seriously about denying law enforcement access to them for any purposes. So here are broadly the dangers of DNA databases. You know, in Britain, genetic samples are taken from people not only on conviction, but on arrest. In some circumstances, witnesses are asked to give genetic samples. And these DNA databases are not merely used to ensure that convicted offenders are not recidivists. They're also used to engage in familial searches. So there was a famous story of a guy who threw a brick through a window and was not able to be identified. They ran the DNA in the general database, couldn't find him, then limited it to people from Surrey and found that there was a near match or a partial match with a limited group of offenders, interviewed the convict whose DNA had the partial match, found out he had a brother in the neighborhood, interviewed the brother, and convicted him. What is the danger of these familial searches? They really raise the specter of notions of genetic surveillance and habitual criminality that date back to Lombroso and to the eugenics movement. The idea that people are more likely to offend in the future, not because of what they've done, but because of who they are, that certain people are predisposed to violence and therefore should be under especially acute surveillance. This is not a theoretical concern. In America, it's been estimated that there's evidence of racially disproportionate conviction rates, and that by doing familial testing in the American DNA databases, 17% of African Americans would be findable through the system as compared to only 4% of the Caucasian population. This is why, when the idea of familial searches is introduced in America, as is now being debated, I think there'll be a passionate debate not only about privacy, but about equality, and the idea that certain segments of the population will be subject to genetic surveillance because of their relatives. Now, what legal principles, constitutional principles, does the ideal of familial searching and genetic surveillance violate? I want to identify a bunch of them, and speaking not in a technical legal term, but just the principles of justice, of a liberal state shared by America and Britain that are implicated by these technologies. The first is the idea that there should not be searches without individualized suspicion for general law enforcement purposes, that the government should have to have a cause to suspect an individual of wrongdoing before it can do a genetic search. I was interested to hear from Ross about the subpoena to the abortion provider. In America, there was a similar subpoena to a hospital that had been treating pregnant mothers and were drug users. And the claim was if there was evidence of drugs in their fetuses, they might be prosecuted for negligent conduct. The Supreme Court refused this search because it held that the purpose of convicting the mothers was not relevant to the reason that they were admitted to the hospital, and you were not allowed to have general searches for broad law enforcement purposes. But these familial searches violate that principle, and if upheld, would be the first time that the Supreme Court has approved of suspicionless searches designed to produce ordinary evidence of criminal wrongdoing for use by the police. The second principle that's violated is deep in our shared legal history, and it really has to do with the corruption of blood. This very basic idea that we should not hold the children accountable for the sins of the fathers. My mother told me when I was young, something I remember very deeply, that you should be responsible not for you should be responsible only for what you do, not for who you are. That basically there should be a notion of wrongdoing, but not wrong being. And that principle is violated by the idea of genetic surveillance. The American Constitution, drawing on British history, prohibits bills of attainder that banish you from civilized society because of what your parents have done. Your father is a traitor. You cannot be made a stranger to the law. But when individual segments of the population are subject to permanent genetic scrutiny because of their blood, literally, that idea of the ability to recreate yourself is threatened. The third principle that's violated is the principle essential to privacy law. Data convicted for one purpose shouldn't be broadly disclosed for another purpose. So the general justification for these DNA databases, in America in particular, was the idea that convicts have a lower expectation of privacy, and to prevent recidivism, they can be subject to greater scrutiny. But once their parents, their families are under permanent surveillance, for reasons that have nothing to do with their own wrongdoing, that principle is violated in a profound way. And the third idea, and the final idea, is this ideal of equality, and the idea that the state should not classify citizens, should not put them in different categories based on their predicted wrongdoing, and the effort to predict future behavior based on genetic predisposition violates basic principles of equality. Now, let's think practically about some solutions to these concerns. Mark began by saying no one should oppose the use of medical databases if properly used, but they need to be well governed and regulated. And I think the panel is in agreement about all this. What would sensible regulations look like? Well, in terms of the regulation of DNA databases for law enforcement purposes, a couple of basic principles would help. The first is the destruction of the original samples. The second principle that would help is limiting the databases to convicted felons. If it's really the most dangerous people who are put in the database, and the databases are limited to ensuring that they are not recidivists, many of us would have fewer problems. But the inexorable political pressure to expand the databases, first to arrestees, then to witnesses, then to give voluntary samples, we're heading toward, you actually in Britain are the future of these surveillance technologies, as you are for so many surveillance technologies, including CCTV cameras and the consolidation of email and national security databases. In this regard, I regret to report you are a model for a fearful world. And in Britain, you're moving toward the the position of Iceland, which constructed a national DNA database of everyone's samples, which were supposed to be surrendered on birth. This is a dystopian vision, and the databases should be limited to convicted felons. And the third, and perhaps the most important principle, is the idea of limitations on access to these databases. The Germans, who have an unusually acute sensibility of the dangers of state power, have a principle in their law that says that broad surveillance authority may be granted, but the information disclosed can only be used for violent crimes and can't be shared for evidence of low-level crimes. So if these genetic databases were really limited to finding suspected terrorists or preventing recidivists, it would be far less dangerous than the possibility that Ross and I were talking about before the panel, that basically you let your dog go on the street and his DNA can be searched and he can be identified, or yours as well. Basically that citizens can be implicated for trivial and low-level crimes and thus subject to constant and ubiquitous surveillance in all forms. So that's my vision for the DNA databases. My colleagues are much greater experts on health databases than I, but I'll just put on the table a question. Perhaps it's naive, perhaps provocative. Mark, will you take my bargain? You can have broad access to these databases for whatever health research you like, but don't give law enforcement access to it for any purpose. Is that a bargain you would take? Thank you so much.
Well, thanks very much to all of my speakers who've kept very, very well to time. What I'm going to do is I will ask them each one question, and then I'll throw it out for everybody here to ask questions, make points, and so forth. Mark, first, you make the point in some of your writings that, similar to what Jeff just said, actually, that there does need to be a lot of rules and regulations containing and controlling these databases. At one point, I was going through your list, and to be honest, it was pretty gigantean. Do you think if we have strict control over these databases in terms of anonymization and confidentiality and access, that they'll still be fit for the purpose that you want them to be fit for, which is to help medical research and treatment?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the great benefits of the computer age is that it does offer a much higher potential degree of control. So, for example, and I've got the numbers, let me just find them. For the VA system, they've got 5.3 million records. In the last 2.5 years, and that was before 2007, they had 20 complaints of security breaches, 70 of them were access of records by unauthorized people, and 3 were released to third parties without consent. They had the data, 7.5 million records. Now, how many examples of paper records have gone astray? So the answer is you can do it. That's the great strength. You can also do it badly, and I'm not an apologist for that.
All right, thanks very much, Mark. Ross, at the beginning of your introduction, you mentioned that people are happy to have their data used for research when they give consent, and that's clearly a good point. But we don't typically want to be giving consent all the time for treatment. And if databases are a part of treatment, can't we treat them in the same way that we treat most types of treatment, which is that basically people want that to happen without the hassle of having to constantly give an informed consent?
Well, some people absolutely demand a right to opt out of some aspects of secondary data use, and in some cases even primary data use. For example, the government's plans to make the Secondary Uses Service database available to all sorts of researchers and commercial companies are opposed by the Catholic Bishops' Conference, who say that pious women should absolutely refuse to have their gynecological records used by companies who are developing abortifacients. A similar view, although different on detail, is taken by the Muslim Doctors Association. So it's not just about privacy. Some people have deep reasons of principle for not wanting their data to be shared. In my own case, I suppose I am an enemy of the database state and the fearful society, and so I am upset at the way in which the Secondary Uses Service is fundamentally designed for surveillance, but with research as an afterthought. And so I'm opposed to something that is sold to us on the basis that it will help medical research when that isn't its real purpose, and I would therefore opt out if I could, and would advise other people to do so until this tension is resolved.
So you think it's a con, basically? Is that what you're saying?
I think the secondary uses service is a con. If you want to do research, you do other things. If you want to do large-scale surveillance and NHS management and cost reduction and so on, then you build the kind of system that they've got. And it's interesting that the secondary uses service basically came out of the old NHS-wide clearing service, which was what was used to pass invoices from hospitals to health authorities. Fundamentally, this is about cost control. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but there would be much less privacy-infringing ways of doing it, and even if it were centralized, which it doesn't have to be, then you would expect under the data protection principles that the data would be destroyed after a year or so, once the payments have been made.
Right. Actually, Tim, I'm tempted to abandon my question and just ask you if you'd like to respond to that.
Well, obviously I completely disagree with Ross, and I hope that's now clear. And on two clear points, there shouldn't be, patients should not have the right to opt out of the secondary user service, because if they do, they degrade the whole thing.
Can you just explain what that means?
Yeah, okay, the secondary user service is every time people go to a hospital, their medical record of the episodes of care that take place in that hospital are coded by guys in the basement into an electronic piece of code, which is then put into the central database. So although there are big arguments about how good the quality of the data itself is, leave those aside for a moment, but this gives a kind of truncated version of the medical record that then goes back to the GP when hopefully you've lived after your treatment in hospital. That data is collected centrally. All the hospitals are required to push that into a central database, which Ross is quite right was originally designed to enable transactions between the centre and its hospitals, and is now being used much more for medical research of the type that I just described. So we in fact derive from those anonymised records the data that allows us to look at death rates in hospitals, for example. And SUS, and without going into the technical detail, that's what it is. The point about a database of that sort, which is actually designed to frankly, first of all, to make sure that hospitals are aware of their quality. I'm sure people here, if you're interested in health, will have followed the political priority of being put around the quality agenda at the moment, and various small DARs, etc., etc. But the original purpose of SUS was administrative. It's now being used to help hospitals manage their services better. So my first argument is, of course, you can't have an opt-out from that service. One of the, in a way, contracts the citizen has with this taxpayer-funded service is that you are going to leave your data behind. You absolutely expect that data to be left behind, so it's confidential. But that data will be anonymised and used to, as I've hopefully pointed out, save lives in other contexts, perhaps in other places. The second thing is that just to correct any any sort of hyperbole that follows what Ross has just said about SUS is not being handed out confidentially to anybody. So people like Dr. Foster Intelligence, indeed in any private commercial organisation, is only ever going to be allowed to receive anonymised data, so anonymised. Well, I've just been in all the negotiations, Ross, and I know that's
I don't believe that the identification of medical databases works. We had this debate in Iceland 10 years ago.
Oh, okay. So
it's a claim that's made by the government, but if you want to look at that, go and read the chapter 9 of my book on security engineering, and I explain in great detail why you cannot do this effectively. And in most cases, it's relatively easy to re-identify data.
Well, put it this way, just because we're obviously going to have a good old ding-dong on this one. As far as we're actually legal, the government has given us, and any other user of this data, a legal guarantee that the data can't be re-identified when it falls into our hands, as it were. So, and one interesting test of that, and perhaps Ross may want to update his book, but one interesting test of that is the fact that GPs are now complaining about SUS because they cannot, it's so well pseudonymised, which is the technical term for anonymisation, they can't actually re-identify it when they want to. So although we have no rights and should never have any rights to see the confidential data on a particular individual, what of course the GP for whose patient that is would like ultimately to be able to convert the anonymised data into identifiable data. But actually the system of anonymisation is so effective they can't do that. So there's a real challenge now for government to try and square that circle. And I think there are issues around that which need to be thought through. So at the moment that doesn't happen, it's actually impossible. So I mean there's obviously a technical issue. I'm not a scientist in the way that Ross is. But those are the points I would make on that. Sorry, a bit long-winded.
That's okay. Thanks very much. We found a point of contention there. Jeff, in your book, you kind of argue that we get the privacy that we deserve. And if somebody goes online and gives up their name and address for a Big Mac voucher, then it's hard to argue that names and addresses are a sacred part of privacy. And so, consequently, the privacy argument gets eroded. do you think we are being too complacent about medical databases, or is there a case here for actually being complacent about them because they are of great benefit to us?
Posing this as an either-or question seems foolish. Surely our debate is not should we have medical databases. Of course we should. There's no reason to resist them in a computerized age. But by the same token, there's no reason to deny the tremendous dangers. And this is not like browsing online. I can go on Amazon and be foolish about the use of my cookies, and perhaps I deserve what I get if I get bad ads or spam. But I can't control the disposition of my DNA, which I leave around in every aspect of life. And the idea that citizens in free societies should have to run the risk of having DNA stored in ways that reveal deep things about their genetic predispositions and then used to convict them for low-level crimes or for forms of social control that have nothing to do with healthcare is completely unacceptable. So far from being too complacent, I think this is a situation where citizens may not understand the dangers of these things before they're too late. We know the slippery slope. These databases are sold as ways of catching terrorists and are then used for forms of low-level offenders. Now, this makes me quite concerned about the future of regulation. So in America, the privacy debate is distorted by the fact that there is not a huge constituency for the privacy of personal data, although there is a strong suspicion of the state. In Europe, it's the opposite. People are more willing to have data privacy laws, but less willing to restrict state data gathering. But who will be the constituency that will insist on sensible regulations of DNA databases? Not the medical profession. We've heard the enthusiasm for this thing among our researcher colleagues. Not the police. Not citizens who tend to be techno-positivists when it comes to medical data. This really, I would think, is a call for the kind of royal commissions, the expert bodies that in Britain have led to sensible regulations of stem cell research, which for me is a model of the kind of regulation we might see in this body. So I've come to this debate in this country to learn more than to instruct. My question back to you or to my colleagues is, can you imagine a situation where some high-level commission would actually impose the kind of limitations on access to these databases that many of us might agree are necessary?
Okay, Mark is desperate to come back, but I'm actually going to ask him to sit on it for a while because I think it's time that I went out there and got some questions and points from the audience. So you don't have to do what I did, which is just ask a question. You can also make points as well. I'll take them in a batch of about 5 or 6, and then, Mark, you will be able to come back, I promise. Okay, I got a hand at the back. Rob.
I think if you look at this debate purely in terms of... can anyone hear me?
Use the mic. Use the mic.
Then it's very hard to argue that, if you have an accident in London, it's a good idea that your doctor in Glasgow can tell them what your medical history is and things like that. It's very hard to argue against that kind of thing if you look at it purely in terms of health. However, the health system operates within a wider social context. And I think this is the problem with this debate, because we live in a society, and particularly as Jeffrey's pointed out, which he always does when he comes over here, it gives me the creeps basically, whenever he says that we're in the forefront of all this stuff.
That's the job.
That we particularly in this country have a government which has an obsession with gathering information about people. It's a kind of flip side of the decline of democracy and of real connections between political parties and people, is that our governments are desperate to find out as much about us as they can and to keep it on record. And I think that's a dangerous thing in and of itself. And if you combine that with the increased tendency to intrude into private and family life and to gather information about our personal lives for the purpose of policing those lives, either through medical health professionals or, Jeffrey says, by the law enforcement. And I actually don't think that distinction, as Ross pointed out, is actually that secure anyway. Then I think this is a very, very dangerous thing. I mean, I've recently discovered that I'm, according to the new campaign, a heavy drinker. I've been redefined as a heavy drinker. I can tell you I've absolutely no intention of telling my doctor that when I go and see him, because I know that in a year or two's time, heavy drinkers their ability to be parents will be put to question, their ability to do their jobs properly will be being put to question. So I think we have to be very, very suspicious about the motives and the way that these things are being carried out and the way that records are being kept on us in such a ubiquitous way.
Actually, if you just pass it forward to the lady in front of you.
One of the things that I noticed in some of the research that I've been doing is the definite policy shifts that happened in the mid-90s around health data collection and the purposes. I think in the sort of early 70s there was a real paucity of data in terms of the nation's health, and I think there was real efforts to try to rectify that. But I think what was really interesting is by the mid-90s, what happens is that there is a real disconnection between the wider social objective of social change and people's personal behaviour. And I think what happens is that the wider objective of social change just disappears from policy. It just goes. And all you're left with is the health establishment's concern about changing people's behaviour. And I think that's what begins to explain this tension between whether or not someone's data is anonymised and the broader research purposes for data collection, is that the objective now seems to be solely about changing people's behaviour and the sorts of points that Jeff Rosen was making about where you come from in your background somehow being some sort of predictor. And I think that's everything that we're doing now. I work in local government, and everything now is about identifying populations and segments with the objective of changing individuals' behaviour. And I think that's the difficulty, is that it's now lost. The wider context of social change has been lost, and now all people want to do is put the blame for social problems down to individuals and what they do.
Thanks very much. The chap in front of you, and then if the microphone can come over here.
What makes these debates interesting and sometimes difficult is obviously these things all do connect up. So, data sharing in all sorts of areas of life is right. And even if people try to resist, you offering the deal earlier on, then, what do you do when a policeman knocks on the door with a court order? The Medical Research Council said, well, it can't refuse that at the end of the day. So even if people try to resist, these things do connect up, whether through law or through politics. But I suppose my attitude towards it does segment a bit, depending on what the purpose of all the kind of data gathering is for and to what use it's going to be put. And in the medical realm, I'm more sympathetic to the medical researchers in terms of what they want to do and why they want to share data and use data. But I wonder how straightforward the case is being made and if some of the difficulties are being acknowledged. So, for example, Mark Walport, you talked about research is done on anonymised information. And Tim, you said at one point that there's a moment where it's identified, but then it's anonymised, and you mentioned somewhere in Imperial College, and the kind of image in the mind is perhaps some computer doing it somewhere, or just maybe some sole person who's kind of going to be shot afterwards, or something like that. It's absolutely kind of a one-way process, and it's all very straightforward. But casting your mind back a couple of years, I was involved in talking to some of the people in the Academy of Medical Sciences when they were doing their report on the sharing of data. And that report was quite interesting because it was quite an honest acknowledgement then of the messiness of the whole process. And the fact that actually scientists, civil servants, somebody actually wants to kind of needs to clean up data, compare different data sets, make sure there's not double counting, all sorts of reasons actually why you want to unanonymise, de-anonymise, compare identifiable, go backwards and forwards. There's lots and lots of reasons why somebody somewhere needs to actually keep making sure the data is fairly pure. And at the end of the day, somebody's got to look at real identifiable names on data to match data sets up. So I think that should be acknowledged, and the case for that should be made. No matter how perfect electronic systems become, all the rest of it, actually, in the real world, we go to different hospitals at different times, we move GPs, we do all sorts of things, which means that it can't be clean and perfect. So if researchers want to use data, even if anonymised data at some point, they need to have real content to that data. And that means actually there has to be a real person somewhere at the end of it, and someone needs to match all that up. So I think we've got to be careful. Mentioning all these systems all sounds really great and nice, but actually, in real life, that's not the way it always works. And that needs to be acknowledged in the case for it made if we're going to kind of justify research in an area when people are very nervous about privacy.
My question is in relation to what Tim was saying before about Dr. Foster. I'm not familiar with the service, but I want to understand, and it may come to some of the things that you were talking about, if by having what you call a safe haven, collecting the data and holding the data, we have a concept of balancing the trust between, do we have the state having the data, or do we have a third party? And if it is a third party, then can you put up walls and barriers around it being used by law enforcement or social security or even welfare fraud or public housing? So if you have it in somewhere that is a safe haven, that is only, say, medical data or medical research, and then they're forbidden from providing that data, does that overcome it? And if so, are you a private company or is it an NGO? And is there barriers around, you know, people say, well, we don't trust the state, but we'll happily trust McDonald's to run it. You know, like, I mean, the concept of private versus public is hard to make.
Okay, so there's a lady here, and then the gentleman in front, and then the lady here, and then I'll bring it back to the panel.
Thanks. This relates a bit to a question raised at the back, which is, what is medical information? I mean, I think that there is a problem here that we do live in a society where things are increasingly becoming medicalised, and it's very difficult to say, you know, what's real medical information, what's kind of behavioural stuff that people want to know and lecture you about, what is stuff that people want to sell you things with, you know. I mean, just a couple of examples. The other day I went to the dentist and got this, you know, you have this thing you're given, a confidential health questionnaire, so you think, well, obviously that's important. I mean, you know, you think, well, they need to know this information, so you fill it in, you know, blah, 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 all these health questions, and then goes back, it's like, how much do you drink, do you smoke, that kind of thing, might leave that, and then, and then you turn over, and it's like, are you happy with your smile? Do you think your teeth are white enough? And then you think, so what are you trying to do here? You know, they're trying to target you to see if you're going to have a treatment, which makes you kind of lose confidence in the whole thing, but because it's all done in under the banner of health, it's, you know, you don't feel like you have a choice other than to fill it in. And in a second example, which isn't really about people selling you things, I think it's just about a kind of worry about the state more, I suppose, is my mind keeps flashing back to my antenatal booking appointments when I had two children fairly recently. And, you know, they ask you, they're sitting there for hours, you know, and they ask you all of these questions. And one of the questions that came up was, is your husband the father of your child? I mean, he is, like, just so you all know. But, you know, so we're bypassing this, and I say, well, why is that relevant? It's none of your business. And she gives a justification, which is all in health terms. You know, well, it might be because he's got, you know, it might be relevant if the baby gets ill, and so we can know the genetic, you know, family history of diseases and all this kind of thing. But I think actually they just wanted to know, you know, is my husband the father? You know, who's the father of your child? Then she reassures me that it's all confidential by proceeding to tell me about a previous woman she's seen. But of course this is all right because, you know, it won't get out. I mean, you think only know how to use computers, you know. I do not believe that this information is confidential. So I think that there is this problem that, you know, health is used as a way of kind of scaring people into giving information, which often isn't health related at all and serves no positive health benefit.
In front of you, Jane.
I want to throw an idea out that I'm not really sure how all this will work, but the idea of evidence-based medicine to me is something slightly problematic in a sense that the evidence seems to mean that you must have some, therefore, better process going on. To put it another way, it's the way in which management predominates over medical practice. I'm very familiar with this in education, because it's my field. And you know, information is everywhere in education, and somehow that gives managers the authority to act. It would seem to me that the evidence that's collected has a purpose, and it's the purpose that is important in determining what evidence is collected in the first place. And you can call it medical evidence if you like, but then if the purpose is public health, then that purpose is governed by who decides what public health issues are. And that isn't the medical profession on its own. That's a dialogue between the medical profession and politicians. And in essence, what you're saying is this is a politically charged sort of project. So, you know, the issue of drinking and public health has been raised, and that's a campaign by government the medical profession involved in this, obviously they've got a stake in it. But it's done not in a neutral fashion. It's not done in a sense where you collect evidence and that evidence is used to look at particular diseases or something that you're worried about. It must be done with something in mind that you want to achieve. Otherwise, that evidence isn't going to serve any purpose. And so I really think you've got to be honest here, that you're not collecting evidence as a neutral fact. You are doing it for a particular purpose. And it's that needs negotiating, that needs discussing, not just saying, well, evidence is great.
Okay. You just pass the microphone forwards and then I'll bring the panel back in.
I just want to say that I think there's actually two different questions here. Number one, there is the medical data that's collected by doctors in the medical profession, and there's the data that's collected possibly by security systems like police, which involves DNA. Now, I may be naive, but as far as I'm concerned, if the medical profession wants to collect as much information as possible about me, that's great, because if anything should happen to me and I'm sick anywhere else, they should be able to access that information across the other side of the world if necessary. Also, I have an older daughter who had an allergic reaction to an anaesthetic. I would be horrified if I thought that the medical profession, because of stringent controls, were being asked permission left, right and centre before they could access her information, by which time it might be too late if she needs a potentially life-saving operation. On the other hand, I do have serious concerns about DNA that might be collected because, for example, DNA can be false. It's used statistically for an approximate match. And we had a discussion yesterday where the DNA of somebody who suffered from severe Parkinson's was used to try and convict him of a crime in another city which he couldn't possibly have made. The DNA can also be used to exonerate by defence lawyers as much as it can be used to try and convict. A lot of the time DNA is used for mopping up volume crimes, so lots of housebreaking, etc. Whereas on the other hand, it's a very serious offence, such as murder, and you always need something further. But what bothers me is that suspects who have never committed a crime, who also have had to part with their DNA, will then remain on a database for DNA as potential suspects. And you could end up with a potential situation of subclass of citizens who are being targeted as potential criminals. Also DNA, which is examined and shows particular profiles where you might possibly become schizophrenic, you might possibly be violent. You could end up in a society where you're being targeted or punished for crimes before you've actually done them. But as far as medical evidence is concerned, I trust doctors. I believe you have my best interests at heart. Therefore, do what you want, take any evidence you want. I don't think anybody else in this room is interested in whether or not, I've got warts or I've got, some kind of skin condition. Nobody else is that interested in me apart from me and my own health services.
Okay, thanks very much. There's a load of really excellent points, and I'm just going to assume that all the panel want to come back. Mark's about to explode if I don't bring him in, so Mark, you can go first. So I'll give you about a minute, and then Jeff, and then
okay,
Ross.
Well, the first thing to say is I agree with you completely. So turning to the DNA, a few facts might be relevant. So the chap that threw the brick through the window, it was actually the window of a lorry travelling on the M3, and the driver was killed. There was a trace of blood on the brick, and it didn't require searching in Surrey. Very straightforward. There was a relative in the database, and on the basis of that, the murderer, and he was a murderer, confessed and was convicted. Now, let's just be clear. The DNA database is a forensic database. It's not a health database. It's not health by doctors. I think there is a very interesting discussion as to the breadth of that database, and I think that there are two defensible positions and one that isn't. The two defensible positions are that the DNA database is restricted only to people who are convicted, and the other defensible position, though not one happen to agree with, is that everyone in the population should be in it. I think we're in a mess at the moment because we sit between the two, and my personal view is it would be best if it was restricted to people who are convicted of crimes. But then, to argue that you shouldn't use that database, and if it turns out that there's a close relative, you use it to track it down, I think is quite difficult to argue. And I would just cite the Innocence Project, where actually hundreds of people have been released from prisons in the United States who've been there for very many years. And if there's one thing people abhor, it's actually people who've been locked up, sometimes on death row, as innocent people. And DNA has got those people out. So let's just be clear. The DNA discussion is a separate discussion. It's not health databases. On the issue of confidentiality, The medical profession is absolutely clear. There's no new principle here. We do not give medical records to anyone else, but actually it is the law of the land that if a judge tells you to, you do it, and that's what democracy is about, that's what the law is about, and that's the rules. There's no question, as it were, Ross says, of people in the BT just giving away this information. There will be protocols in place that say they can't do it, and only judges will do it. On the issue of confidentiality, and then I'll stop because there's lots of other stuff I could
Thank
say.
you.
The risks to confidentiality, again, there's nothing new. So medical records, as part of their transfer, if a hospital writes a letter to a general practitioner, the receptionist opens the letter, they see the information about Mrs. Bloggs, who may be someone in their community. There have always been risks like that, and that's actually where the breaches of confidentiality occur. The health kit team is actually much broader than people think. And I would argue that part of that health team are the people who anonymise data for research purposes, because research purposes is about improving health. And one should be absolutely transparent. Yes, there are people who will act as the mediators, who will take confidential information and anonymise it, although increasingly with computer systems that will be done actually without any human intervention. Those people may have information. They will be bound by the same duty of confidentiality that the doctor, the nurse, and the receptionist are bound to as well. And there's no problem with that.
Okay, thanks, Jeff.
Well, I guess I have the answer to my question. My bargain to Mark is, yes, indeed, let's have lots of medical research. The deal is that law enforcement can't have access. And he said, absolutely not. There's no trouble at all. He said, first, DNA databases are totally separate from health databases because that's law enforcement and health is different. Second, he said, there's no problem because judges will supervise it, and as long as it's according to law, we shouldn't worry, and there's nothing new. All of these three propositions are wrong and completely unconvincing. Aside from that, they're excellent arguments. The DNA database debate is a vision of the privacy dangers we will face in a world of unregulated access to health databases, regulated only by the necessity of a valid court order. Do you know what a valid court order requires? Only that the information is relevant to a legitimate criminal investigation. So if there's some extremely vague possible connection between DNA of a low-level crime and access to the database, you can get it. So right now under the DNA database, you only get the junk DNA, the identifying factor, but if it's a health database, you get my entire genome. So this is why we should be really concerned about this problem, why judicial orders are completely inadequate as a form of protection, why even existing medical privacy laws, which I think are more strenuous in America than they are here, which generally prohibit sharing of medical information except for legitimate law enforcement purposes, are also completely inadequate, and why I really I'm not being facetious here. I think we should really, and I'll press the audience and the rest of my colleagues, think about treating these medical databases separately and making an exception to the general rule that you can have access to them for law enforcement purposes because of the dangers, which are not. It's not that this is nothing new. There's always a problem of medical confidentiality and it can be abused. The degree of the intrusion, when you have not just my, cold or my most recent disease, but my entire genome, my predispositions to commit future action is available to the state. The magnitude of that privacy violation is so much greater than what we've traditionally dealt with that we have to think about this differently. Most of the points, I think, from the audience supported this, what seems to me commonsensical notion. I think you understand, beginning with Rob Killick's wonderful revelation that he wasn't going to tell his doctor about his drinking problem. Rob, great way to announce that on Fora TV and on the web. Let's hope your doctor doesn't surf for Google, otherwise you're going to be in really good shape. We won't tell anyone, so that's no problem. The idea that you should have to worry about that also shows why it's different than just surfing Amazon. I can choose not to surf Amazon. You and I can't choose not to go to the doctor. This is just not an option, which is why we have to think of the entire category separately. And the general pressures, as you noted, to focus on ideas of predictive criminality and to emphasize groups' predisposition to commit future bad actions rather than thinking of social responses will show the political pressure to actually use this data in all sorts of illicit ways. So this brings me finally, so the question is, what's the solution? Let me be a little more specific. Mark didn't take my bargain. Let's think about less dramatic possibilities. So one possibility, I think you raised it, sir, was maybe we should think about third-party databases differently than databases held by the state and rely on judges to decide on a case-by-case basis. Certainly the court order is a meaningless protection. That's just relevance. But you could have judges do a more complicated balancing test. A second is we could create property rights in our genetic information. And basically I could sue if I go to Mark's database and I think it's going to be used for health, but then it's turned over to the judge on a court order. You violated my property rights. I think too complicated too, and the idea of litigation as basically protecting us from this sort of thing is inadequate too, which is why I'll just come back. I'll put it back on the table, see if anyone else buys it, have the databases, but no access for law enforcement.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay, Ross?
Well, there's a number of points have risen there. On anonymized data, the typical way of anonymizing stuff in secondary use is that they remove your name and address, they leave your date of birth and postcode. That's what happened until a few years ago when we pointed out to the chief medical officer that 1 or 2% of the population would escape, soldiers, prisoners, students, where you had people with the same birthday living at the same postcode. So they decided to change the rules so that not even those wicked students would escape. And now they put your NHS number on as well. Now, even if they encrypted the NHS number, it still doesn't work. We had this debate in Iceland, and there's been a big debate in America where a lady called Latanya Sweeney has shown that she can easily re-identify much of the supposed anonymous material that's released by the likes of the Veterans Administration. If you can ask a question such as, show me the records of all women in Britain who are 34 and who have a daughter aged 14 and both mother and daughter have psoriasis, bang, bingo, 1 record out of 60 million, no problem, right? If a database is rich enough that you can ask questions on perhaps 5 or 6 different attributes of the data subject, then you've got them, right? Now, there are 1 or 2 databases that are so tightly designed to answer particular specific questions that you can use anonymization. But as a general proposition, it is just not true that you can use anonymization to protect people's privacy in medical records databases that are rich enough to be really useful for research. On the judge's side, I agree entirely with Jeff. In Britain, a judge will grant a warrant for special material. He has to under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act if it's actual evidence of a crime. Now, saying to a pregnancy advisory service, your patient's under 16, that's actual evidence of a crime. If a judge doesn't grant that, he's acting against the law, and the police would quite rightly go to the next judge down the corridor and get it from him. What has changed is not the law. What has changed is the technology and the context. Because all of a sudden, by taking all the data together from different medical practices and hospitals and putting it in one big pot, you've created a circumstance in which a huge amount of data can be collected, of very, very sensitive data, in a way that was never foreseen when Parliament passed the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. Let me give you another example that I was debating not so long ago with a former chief constable. Why doesn't the police go to the appropriate medical records database and ask for information about everybody who has admitted to their doctor that they use illegal drugs? That's clearly of use to the local drug squad in planning its operations. Again, it's actual evidence of a crime. You've confessed that you're a criminal to your doctor. He's typed it into your computer. The information is sitting there whirring around on BT's servers, and the police go to a judge and they say, we want that. How do you stop it? The only feasible way that you stop it is by going to the European Court of Justice, and that's only going to happen if the person on whom the warrant is served looks the policeman straight in the eye and says, I'm not giving it to you. I'll see you in Strasbourg first. Is a 26-year-old BT technician in Sunbury-on-Thames going to do that? No way.
Thank you very much. Tim?
I'm not going to talk about anonymity. We just have to possibly disagree on that point. But I just want to pick up a couple of other points that were made. The issue around segmentation, I was in two minds about whether or not to go into this, because in a way, if we can move on from this argument about whether or not the NHS should have management information, because that's kind of what I was talking about, onto a much more, I think, challenging agenda, which is how do we get to a point where government departments and local public services share data much more operationally about people? I mean, in a way, potentially far more intrusively than is currently the case. At the moment, we are talking about a health systems data that is in a silo over here. You know, Ross has called it SUS. But actually, we're not yet talking about whether we should have incapacity benefits data, linked to health data, linked to crime data, so that we can build pictures of our communities which are much more meaningful to them and for public service planners than, say, just going after health. Because we know that there are people with very clustered, complex needs that cover the whole spectrum of public services, and my view is that if we can have data sets that allow us to predict what kinds of services those people need, segmentation is a technical word which the lady raised at the back there, but that's what I'm talking about, it will be to the public good. And that's an argument I think actually I and others need to make. It hasn't been made yet. And there are discussions going on at the moment about how Whitehall can bring these databases together. And I think there are people will have very legitimate concerns about what the rules are around that, because that hasn't really started to happen yet, not at least in public services. So that's just one thing over there, and I think that's an important debate and one I'd like to have. That relates to safe havens. I mean, it's a shame Mark didn't talk a little bit about that, perhaps he will later, but I think there's another really important debate to be had around that. At the moment, there are academic bodies that are regarded by the current legal structure as it were safe havens. There are no private companies that are allowed to fulfil this function. There is I won't go through all the legal stuff, but there's a body called PIAG which authorises bodies to hold confidential data, and there are no private sector organisations that have that right. But I do think there's an issue about whether or not government and or third parties, what the long-term rules should be. There's a body called the Information Governance Board, which is just being set up at the moment, and I'd have thought its principal issue will be, and I will welcome, I'm sure, your comments in due course, the chair is a guy called Harry Caton, to come up with a different approach to third-party, the rules around third parties and safe havens. And then related to that, and this is taking it on a little bit further, is there's a lady who raised the issue of going into the dentist and being flogged a product, crowned teeth or whatever it was. I think that's a real challenge, and I'll shut up in a second, which is that there is a more commercial environment in the health service at the moment. Hospitals are competing with each other. What do we do when we get to the point where a hospital wants to direct market its services to us using this data in a very abstracted form? We haven't had that conversation yet, and we should be having it.
Thanks very much. Right, we are very short of time now, but I do have enough time to go out for one more round. Brevity and conciseness will be very much appreciated at this point. Okay, over here.
I guess it's just kind of a comment really about the kind of concept of privacy. I've always kind of liked the US version of privacy because it's obviously emerged from a kind of historical process, and it encapsulates the idea of privacy from the state, basically. Whereas in the UK, it's much more kind of a confused idea. And you end up kind of spending time discussing kind of trivial cases about Z-list celebrities not wanting to be photographed by paparazzi and things. But I suppose my point is really that there's a lot of water under the bridge since the kind of US concept of privacy kind of codified a certain attitude towards the state at that time. And I suppose maybe to kind of pick up on the example that the two speakers on the end were touching on, the kind of the guy convicted of murder on account of throwing the brick through the truck window and things. I would think that most people now would say that's a good thing, somebody got convicted of a crime. And there would be very few people who would say, actually, there are more important principles than, there are more important things than convicting someone of a crime. The principles are more important. And I guess that's kind of part of what the problem in this discussion is.
Okay, so there was a hand there, and then there was a hand here, and then here, and I'm sorry, we'll have to leave it at that. So, in the middle there.
Hi, I just wanted to question, this must be me being naive, but you talked about how this woman in Iceland was able to re-identify her data. She knew exactly what she was looking for. She knew to make the search the 2 daughters, age 34, whatever it was. If you know that much data about who you're searching for, surely the purpose of re-identifying it is just trying to prove a principle, and it's actually meaningless anyway.
Celebs.
Pardon? Sorry, I didn't hear that.
No, celebrities. You know enough about celebrities to identify them from an anonymous database.
Okay. Yeah, that fair enough.
Nice and forward. Oh, sorry, the lady behind.
I have a question for the lawyer. It's about Germany. Do you have any more information? Germany is obviously very, very sensitive.
Hitler changed the legal system there. There have been attempts to change the legal system here. I wonder if you have anything to say about Germany and how they are trying to protect the individual from the state.
And then the last question here, and then I'll bring the panel back in. Gotcha.
Yeah, I get frustrated around this kind of debate because I think we're talking about real minuscule, minor edge case, likelihood here. The examples Mark's given, 7.5 million records and 20 complaints, really things going to third-party hands. Yes, there are celebrities. There's an example of George Clooney's medical record being looked at in his surgery area, but these are minor relative to the kind of the benefits we can receive if we have this intelligence, better intelligence over mass data. The problem is we spend so much time thinking about security and privacy of this data, we don't actually kind of look at how we can make the data better and make it more reliable, more trustworthy, think about how these different clinical systems can actually talk to each other, because that's why National Programme for IT isn't working, and actually kind of focus on that. And actually I'd like to see the information being extended through into DNA stuff, so we can actually learn and get greater intelligence about predicting potential future conditions, so that I know, that my mother might be at risk of getting breast cancer, so early on, so she can change her behaviour early on in her life, so she doesn't have to suffer that later on.
Okay, thanks very much. So I'm going to bring the speakers back in the reverse order, so it'll be Jeff, then Tim, then Ross, then Mark. You only have 60 seconds, gentlemen, I'm afraid, so obviously you can't address everything in your summing up. But Jeff, off you go first.
The question of familial searches is a good challenge that the gentleman raises. I agree that we might disagree in this room about whether it's appropriate to use DNA partial matches to find near relatives. I think that it's much more defensible for murder than for low-level crimes, but I guarantee if this gets up and running in the United States, as the FBI is now proposing, and African Americans recognize that they are much more likely to be genetically surveilled than everyone else, there will be a firestorm, a debate about equality that will make the privacy debate look tame. In Germany is a model for sensitive regulation of these things. I know Ross knows more about this than I, but I gather in addition to ensuring that data can only be used for serious crimes but not low-level crimes, they've refused to consolidate their databases, and by ensuring that the locals can't share, have provided a model for privacy. And I don't agree that we're so concerned about privacy that we're not improving the databases. The impulse toward consolidation is far more powerful than the privacy concerns, but certainly improving the data would help. Ladies and gentlemen, we have wonderful debates about privacy at the Battle of Ideas, but we are on the verge of a brave new world when we think about genetic surveillance for predispositions to future behavior. Health privacy is the one area that all of us care about. Net, the rest of it, it's hard to actually relate to our lives, but there may not be many abuses now, but as these subpoenas become more intrusive, as abortion clinics and juveniles and Rob is subpoenaed for his drinking problem, citizens around the UK and around Western Europe and in the US will rise up, and that is why perhaps in 10 years when we meet again at the Battle of Ideas, I hope that my bargain will be taken and we have these databases